Some years later, I had a very good friend who was assigned to the Pine Ridge Reservation just after he graduated from medical school and had completed his internship. If I remember correctly, it was about 1905. He told me that he arrived at Pine Ridge just after payday with less than $1 in total assets. In those days, they paid every 3 months, and he said that his salary was $100 per month. He said that when he arrived, he was wearing a dress suit and a plug hat, which caused considerable comment by the natives. As the Indians at that time did not trust the doctors very much, he waited on everybody that became sick. He told me that 2 things happened that caused the local yokels to accept him. One day while in Kyle, a substation, the local trader told him he was going to shoot one of his horses. When the young doctor asked why, he said that the horse was badly wire cut, could not recover, and he was going to put him out of his misery. The doctor asked to see the horse, saw that the wound was repairable, and said that he would fix it if the trader wanted him to. The trader granted permission. He told me that he shaved the hair from around the wound, cleansed it out, and sewed it up as he would that of a human being. The wound healed so well that it was hard to find a month or so later. He said that one night a rider came into the agency and reported that a cowboy's wife was going to have a baby. He hitched up his team and started for the cowboy's home, taking a local man along for a guide. The doctor said that the wagon ride had aggravated her condition, and when he met them, the time had arrived. The doctor delivered the baby on a blanket, far from any habitation. The woman and the baby were fine, but the cowboy fainted during the event. After returning to headquarters, the guide told about the father fainting, as he thought it was a pretty good joke. After those 2 episodes, the young doctor was accepted as one of the boys. He told me that he was later transferred to
Moenkopi, I think.
Moenkopi.
No.
To Moenkopi.
Yeah, Moenkopi.
And was ordered to visit the Hopi village once a month. At that time, the Hopi people would not accept the services of a white doctor. He said that it was a long trip by team and buggy. The Hopi people had chickens, and the people at the sub-agency had no chickens. He would carry a pocket full of nickels and buy eggs from the Hopi children and take them back to the Moenkopi. His trip was not a total loss. He said that after some time in the egg business, some of the Hopi people began to consult him on medical matters. Among the Sioux, the burial of the dead was a well-attended event. At the north end of the village was an Episcopal church, and about 1/2 mile to the south was the Catholic church. A few years after our arrival, a Presbyterian mission was constructed west of the village. Although I doubt that the Indians took the same view of the white man's religion that we did, they did conduct most of their funeral services in the church buildings and used graveyards just east of the churches. They were always well attended, as after the ceremony, everything that the deceased owned was given away. I said that they were well attended, but that was not always true, as so many Indians died during the flu epidemic in 1918 that it was not long before they were buried with very little ceremony and only 2 or 3 in attendance. There was one story that went around that I cannot verify, but this old Indian was on his deathbed. He had considerable property, therefore the giveaway would be quite lucrative. There was also an Indian fair coming up at Black Pike, about a day's journey east of Lips Camp by team and wagon. His friends could not miss the giveaway, nor could they miss the fair. And as the old man was in a coma, they waited until 2 days before the fair, buried him, had the giveaway, and left for the fair the following day. I guess that they did not bother with death certificates at that time. On another occasion, the local boss farmer almost got into trouble. There was no such thing as an undertaker on the reservation then. In case of death, the friends of the deceased built the casket and buried the dead. Old Black Whistler lived alone and died unattended. The boss farmer went to his place with some Indians and found the old man dead. And as he had been dead for several days, he was pretty ripe, and not knowing what to do, they just burned the house down, which did a good job of cremating him. Somehow word got back to the agent at Pine Ridge, and there was an investigation, but nothing came of it. In a book written by D. Brown regarding the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he says, in describing the Sioux Indian village the day before the battle, that a couple of Sioux were fishing, perhaps. But after we came to Lipp's camp in 1914, we went fishing at a dam several miles from the village, and the fish were very eager to bite, even on hooks without any bait. Although at that time the Indians did not have enough to eat, I do not remember any Indian fishing, even though there were plenty of fish in the streams and the ponds. Some years later, when I was employed at the Pine Ridge Agency handling cost accounting and purchasing, the woman in charge of the welfare program determined that fish was the proper food to supplement the Indians' diet. At that time, the relief was handled by buying food in large quantities and giving it to those on the welfare rolls. She came into my office one day with a request for a carload of mackerel in brine. I took the request to the administration officer and expressed some concern whether the Sioux would eat fish. I suggested that if she wanted to try it, then she should buy a barrel or two of
Mackerel, fish, and whatever.
fish and try it, I guess. He took the request, and the next day the welfare head came in with a request for 1 barrel of fish, which we ordered. Shortly thereafter, I was transferred to the Southwest. Some years later, the man that gave out the rations at the Pine Ridge Agency visited us at White River, Arizona. As I was curious about the outcome of the mackerel, I asked him about it. His reply, "So you were the fellow," and that was not the exact word that he used, that ordered the damned mackerel. We would put one fish in each welfare box. The Indian would take the box, and as they went around the warehouse, they'd throw the fish alongside the building.
Oh my gosh.
It got to stinking so bad that we finally took the rest of the fish out on the reservation about 15 miles and buried it. I was back there a year later, and all the grass was dead around the place where we buried it.
Oh.
And they wanted the Indians to eat that stuff. Oh yes, he was a Sioux Indian. Until recent years, the Apache Indians did not eat fish. Back to the subsistence of the Sioux in the teens, the years of the century, that is. At that time, there was an issue day each month. They were given flour, beans, bacon, or rather fatback, and of course fresh beef. As a small boy, the beef issue interested me most. Each month, about 10 head of cattle were purchased by the government and placed in the corrals next to the slaughterhouse. The Indians butchered the cattle themselves, and the beef was cut up and weighed on platform scales. I remember one old Sioux chief, who after removing the bile sac from the liver, opened the sac and drank some of the bile, then smacked his lips as though it were a delicacy. The other Indians laughed and cheered their approval. I never saw another Indian do likewise. I'm sure it was another way of showing bravery by doing something distasteful and showing no sign of displeasure. The Indians that I have known did not care for prime beef, but preferred the red meat of range-fed beef. They also liked the shoulder cuts, as they boiled most of their beef. The round was used to make jerky. The round would be cut in thin slices lengthwise with the grain and hung on racks to dry in the sun. In addition to issue food, a few raised small gardens. As all food was considered community property, those people who raised large gardens soon became discouraged, as all of their neighbors would move in and help them eat it up as soon as it was ripe. Indian turnips was an important item of diet. The dictionary says that the Indian turnip is a jack-in-the-pulpit, which I suppose is correct. They grow wild on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The roots are shaped somewhat like a red radish, and the root is shaped something like a red radish, and is covered with a tough skin that peels off easily. The meat is white and very tasty when fresh. They not only eat them fresh, but they thread them on strings and dry them for future use. There are wild fruits along the creeks that are also eaten by the Sioux. Choke cherries, buffalo berries, and cherries, strawberries, and wild plums. I've seen Indian women take fresh choke cherries and jerky, run the combination through meat grinders, and make the combination into patties, about the size that we use for hamburgers, and dry them for future use. In this process, they do not remove the pits from the cherries, but they grind them right into the concoction. The Sioux are said to be dog eaters. Yes, they eat dog, but mostly as a ceremonial dish. At what we call their fairs, the food for one day was usually dog. The women did all of the work of killing, preparing and cooking the dog. It was usually tied up the night before. In the morning, she'd hit the dog over the head with a club, take the dead animal by the feet, and singe off the hair over an open fire. Then cut up the dog and put the meat in a kettle of boiling water. I remember one time a friend of ours, a young man, brought a young girl from the east to see the Indian fair at Lips Camp. They came in the afternoon and stayed at our house overnight. She was sure that Alfred, the young man, had been telling her a lot of tall tales about the Indians. She said, "He even told me that they eat dog." The next morning after breakfast, we took her out to see the Indian camp. All of the Indian women were in the process of preparing dog for the feast that day. It did not take her long to spit up her breakfast and return to the sanctuary of our home. She had had enough of Indian watching. There was a small root vegetable that grew alongside the creek that we boys ate. We called it pungi by the Indian boys. It was called pungi by the Indian boys. And that is the only name that I ever knew for it. When I think about the Sioux Indian of that period, I wonder how they survived. Outside of small incomes from the sale of wooden posts, ease of their allotment and income from wages, for those few who worked for ranches or the government, their main source of food was from government rations, wild vegetables and fruits, the small wild animals that they were able to catch, and a very few that raised small gardens. I remember one afternoon Philip Two Elk cornered a skunk down by the creek, and after quite a battle killed it with stones and clubs. It was his idea that I participated in this at his request. It was only after the creature was dead and he took it home that I realized that he wanted it because he was hungry. It was in the summertime, and the skin was not prime and of little value. That day when I returned home from the south, the direction from which the wind was blowing, I saw the windows and doors in the house go shut. Mother met me at the door with an armful of my clothes and told me to go to the creek and take a good bath, change into some clean clothes, and throw the old boots away. And there was another source of beef that would probably repulse most people. But when people are very hungry, any food is better than none. If you've read any history, you know that some very respectable people have indulged in cannibalism to survive. The Sioux did not resort to that practice. During that period, there were quite a few cattle on the reservation owned by non-Indians that leased their land. With range cattle, there's always a number that die each year from various causes. With the exception of those killed by lightning, the Sioux would eat any animal they found that had died. I remember one winter when our horses had gotten out of the pasture and I was riding the range looking for them. I saw a team and wagon coming and rode over to ask if they had seen any horses. As I neared the outfit, I could smell decaying flesh. The occupants were a Sioux family. In the wagon was the remains of a dead cow. Apparently someone had skinned it for the hide, and the coyotes and the buzzards had eaten part of the flesh. They had found the animal in that condition and were taking it home to replenish their larder. The eating of prairie dogs, skunks, and dog may not sound very appetizing to the average person today, but when you consider some of the things we eat today, it is only a matter of custom as to what is good and what is not. The prairie dog eats nothing but grass, whereas the chicken that's running loose will eat anything. And also, if you think back on how it was necessary for the Indians to live before the advent of the horse into his society, it is easy for me to understand why he used small animals for food. Most of the cooking that I observed was done in cast-iron kettles over open fires. Those Indians that lived in log houses had wood cooking ranges and did their cooking in conventional kettles on the range. At a big gathering one time I saw a cooking method that I presume was used in the olden times. On a tripod was hanging the stomach of a cow, tied shut at the bottom and about half full of water. Into this was dropped chunks of meat and stones that had been heated in a fire that burned nearby. The hot rocks caused the water to boil, cooking the meat. My father had forbidden me to eat at the Indian homes, as he said they could not afford to feed me. Mother was a little more blunt. She told me to eat at home, as she did not want me to get sick on contaminated food. I remember once I was playing with one of my Indian friends. It was late in the day, and I'd already had my evening meal, but I stayed while they ate, and I saw what Father meant when he said that they could not afford to feed me. There was no table. A blanket was spread on the floor, and the main dish was placed in the center of the blanket. The family sat in a circle around the dish. Only one knife was used. To serve himself, a person would hold a part of the meat with the hand and cut off a piece of meat and eat it. If I remember correctly, that is all that they had for that meal.
There's so many things in there that I never was aware of or knew about. Fairs.
There is in that, Leonard. That's a good book. I'm not fooling you. And you know how it would be if it were published, what they would do. They'd edit it, and it would come out really corking.
Oh, it's got
really
so
is.
much
Wonderful
in
book.
it.
It
And
is.
right now,
Shall I record?
Yeah. Okay.
Fairs.
I had no desire to publish it.
No.
One thing that I
Needed
remember
money.
about the early days at Lips Camp was the annual Indian gatherings. They were not fairs as we know them today, but were gatherings that lasted several days. They were held at several locations on the reservation, but from 1914 through 1918, the ones held at Lips Camp were the very big ones. Indians would come from all parts of South Dakota. I remember one year in particular, as it was the largest gathering they ever held. The ceremonial grounds were just in front of the government compound, and not too far from our front porch. The first thing that was constructed in preparation for the event was a large area, probably 100 feet by 75 feet, that was used for meetings that were held in the morning and for dances at night. Round the area, in a kind of horseshoe shape, 2 rows of poles were erected. The rows were about 10 feet apart, with light logs running along the top of each row. One end was left open. Over the top of the poles, pine boughs were placed to provide shade for the spectators. Also, several large teepees were erected nearby. An area for shinny was staked out, and a crude racetrack was cleared off. Several days before the fair started, the wagons started arriving. With the exception of a few traditional teepees, nearly all of the Indians used canvas wall tents. Indians from certain areas would set up their tents on a certain street. Those from Standing Rock in one area, those from Rosebud in another, and so forth. I say street, as the first family to pitch his tent would drive stakes on one side to secure the ropes from the top of the wall and attach ropes from the other side to the wagon wheels. The second person to set up his tent would secure the ropes on one side to his neighbor's wagon, and on the other side to his own wagon, and so on until the street was completed. I don't know how many wagons arrived that year, but I'm sure there were about 1,000 tents. I seem to remember Father said there were some 1,000 camps. At sunup you would hear the drums beating, and an old Indian man would ride through all the areas, making announcements of the day's events. All meals were prepared over open fires in front of the tents. The women would start to prepare the meal early in the morning. If it was a feast day, the main course would be boiled dog, prepared as previously described. In the morning, the area described above, a large gathering would take place where various orators would talk. I never knew what they said, but most of them used arm and body movements along with their speeches. One expression used quite often was to hold the arms as if shooting a gun, slap the extended hand with the back of the other hand, and then the extended arm would fall as if something had been killed. I often wondered if they were describing a bison kill or perhaps the Battle of the Little Bighorn. About noon, this meeting would be adjourned and everybody would go to his camp to eat the main meal of the day. After the noon meal, the announcer would again ride through all the areas, broadcasting the events of the afternoon. The afternoon activities consisted of bronc riding, horse races, shinny games, and various contests. One contest I remember was one of physical agility. A stake was driven into the ground with a top some 6 inches above the surface. Money was placed on the top of the stake. The object was to dance up to the stake, bend over, and pick the money up with your mouth. This was to be done with no part of the body touching the ground except the feet, and dancing during the entire performance. The dance was the Sioux War dance. Very few were able to do it. After the break for the evening meal, the Sioux dances would go on all night. They had an orchestra usually composed of 4 men who sang the songs around the drum, stick in one hand, holding a strap attached to the drum with the other. They had various songs that they sang, but I only remember 2 types of dances they performed during that era. The so-called war dance, where the men danced individually in the center of the arena, each man using his own style of dancing, but always keeping time with the drum beats with his feet. Some of the steps were quite complicated. Some would bend over while dancing and move their heads in time with the music, looking around on the ground as if searching for something. The women also danced, but stood erect, the whole body going up and down in time with the music, and with a slight movement in one direction. The women would be in a line at the outer edge of the dance arena. The other dance was known as the crow dance. This was danced a few times during the night. A woman would select a man, and they would dance side by side as the women did during the war dance. After this dance, the woman would take the man back to where she got him, and the man would give her something, usually money. Some years later, the Sioux developed what they called the rabbit dance, where the man and woman danced side by side, holding hands. During 1914 to 1918, I never saw this dance performed, nor did I hear of the name. During that period, I never saw the Sioux do the sun dance, as it had been prohibited by the Indian Service regulations. At all dances, both the men and women were dressed in dance costumes. The men with feathered headdresses, beaded or porcupine quill jackets and leggings, and always beaded moccasins. A few costumes were decorated with elk's teeth. The women's dress was long dresses decorated with beads, porcupine quill work, or elk's teeth. I don't remember that the women ever wore feathers. Both the men and women painted their faces for the dance. During the fair, some enterprising Indian would establish temporary stores selling mostly food produce to the people. I'll always remember on one sign on one of these outlets that read, "Apples 2 for 5 cents, 3 for a dime." I said there were no stores in Lips Camp when we arrived in 1914, which was true, but the following year 2 Indians established stores or trading posts. Buckshot Russell at the north end of town and Short Bull at the south end village. Neither carried a very big supply of goods, and what they did carry was designed for the Indian trade. As explained previously, there was always a sunrise charge at all of their fairs. There were fairs at other towns on the reservation, but many of them were influenced by non-Indian residents. I believe the Lips Camp gathering attracted more Indians from a wider area than the possible exception, with the possible exception of Pine Ridge. Language. During those years, I learned enough of the Sioux language to understand basic communication in their language. Basically, verbs have 3 endings, one used by women, one used by men, and one when addressing a crowd. For the Sioux word, give me, maku, is used by men, makui, used by women, and makui, makuo, when addressing a group of people. I'll spell that. MAH-KUO is the last one. One thing that would happen as a result of this peculiarity was always a good joke among the Indian men, When a white family would move on to the reservation, they would probably hire an Indian woman to help the woman of the house get located. The man, wanting to have a good rapport with the people, would desire to learn some of the Sioux language. He would ask the Sioux woman for some words, which she would give him in the feminine, of course. Later, while working with some men, he would ask for something in Sioux, using the feminine Makui, M-A-H-K-U-E. The men would laugh, all laugh, and the poor fellow would think his enunciation was poor. Writing the Sioux language is quite difficult, as they have a guttural sound for which we have no letters, such as Wambly for a Sioux word for eagle. The N has a guttural rather than the N sound we use in English. Another thing, in speaking in Sioux, you put the verb at the end of the sentence. When I speak the Sioux language, I'm speaking of Teton Sioux, which is some different from the Santee Sioux. For example, the word for friend in Teton is Kola, where in the Santee it is Koda. Dakota is from Santee, but is pronounced Lakota in the Teton.
Oh, I knew that.
The fighting word among the white boys that I have known was SOB, which classifies your mother in the dog family. Among the Sioux boys at Lips Camp, the fighting word was Sagalaputa. I was never able to get an interpretation of the words in English. Years later, when I worked at Pine Ridge, I asked an Indian if he knew what it meant. He said he had never heard of it. I do not know that an English phrase would cause a fight. I do know that an English phrase would cause a fight among Indian boys was to call him rabbit ears. One phrase that I learned early was Aguapi Wanzi Maku, literally interpreted, bread one give me. It might seem that Indian people were not very aggressive, and they should have exerted more effort to make a living. Here we had a proud people whose way of life had been built around their own customs and were dependent upon animals for the main source of food. They had fought for their way of life, but had been defeated in battle, placed on reservations, and their main source of food had been eliminated by the invaders. Of course, they had no love for the white man or any of his ways. They had a strong desire to return to their own way of life. Even their names had been changed into the English language, and the government was forcing them to learn a language foreign to them. In their tongue, any word describing a natural act is not obscene, as many of them are in the English language. Marriage. During my early years at Lips Camp, there were several older men that had more than one wife. This was against Bureau policy, as it was not legal to have more than one wife according to our laws. In the case of the older Indians, this must have been overlooked. One story I heard from an Indian some years later I thought was interesting. The Indian agent was talking to an old Indian who had 2 wives. He told him such a practice was illegal. He should get rid of one of his wives. The old Indian thought about it for a long time and then said to the agent, I agree. Should not have 2 wives. You pick the one that is to go, and you tell her to go.
That is good.
The agent decided that he had business elsewhere. Living in Lips Camp was an Indian family named Crazy Horse. They had several children. I was told that the mother was the widow of the famous Crazy Horse, that when she remarried, after she was widowed, her new husband took that name. I don't know whether marriage licenses and formal ceremonies were required at that time or not. I do know that a traditional ceremony was practiced, which probably varied somewhat from the original. The man courting the girl would ride to her house or tent on a horse with a yellow slicker draped over his shoulders. If the girl accepted him, she came out of her house and stood beside his horse. The man would drape the slicker over her shoulders, and she would mount the horse behind him, and they would ride away on their honeymoon. Before the public school system was established in Washington County, Jim Garner, a rancher who lived on Bear Creek, had a private school for his several children. He had hired a young woman to teach the school who was young, single, and good-looking. A young Indian man by the name of Herbert Holyoke, who had just returned to the reservation after being educated in off-the-reservation school, was quite a frequent visitor at the Garner Ranch. They were both young and became friendly. Jim had warned her not to get too familiar with Herbert unless she was in earnest, as he would take her advances seriously. She didn't believe such advice from an old man and continued her association with Herbert. After school was out, she stayed at our house for a few days, and Herbert was a daily visitor, dressed in his finest white man's clothes. One warm sunshiny day, Herbert rode up to our house on his best horse and dressed in his best clothes with a yellow slicker draped over his shoulder. I don't remember just what happened, but he was turned down. Herbert rode off, and we didn't see him for a long time. He was a proud man, and his pride had been crushed. There was a judge in Kadoka that married Indian people. His ceremony was something like this, to the man. Do you promise to work hard and make money so you can buy clothes and food for